Hi, it's Fraser here. Before we get on to this week's Spiked podcast, I just wanted to remind you to get your signed copy of Brendan O'Neill's After the Pogrom. We've got a limited time offer on right now, where if you donate £50 or more to Spiked, you will get a signed copy plus a year's membership to Spiked supporters and all the perks that come with it. So remember to donate £50 or more to Spiked and you will get this signed copy of After the Pogrom by Brendan O'Neill. To find out more, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. Now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome back to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and I'm delighted to be joined, as ever, by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And returning guest, Spiked columnist, Luke Gittos.
Hello.
Got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing next week's US elections, the madness of slavery reparations, and why it's so difficult to talk about Southport. US elections next week, probably the tightest elections in living memory. I think in the past week or so, we've seen people go low quite a lot, I think it's fair to say, Tom. Mm-hmm. Kamala and her campaign are outright calling Trumpist Nazis. They're not even calling them semi-fascists or authoritarian or skirting around it in any way, particularly after this rally Trump held in Madison Square Garden. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
No, absolutely. I think we've become a bit too accustomed to this level of hyperbole isn't the right word, but, just outright blatant demonization of Trump and his support base. But I think it was really striking this time around as well, with this big rally in Madison Square Garden, as you say, tens of thousands of people there, and pretty mainstream outlets just openly comparing it to Nazism. To specifically, there was infamously a rally of Nazi supporters, of American Nazis in 1939 that took place at Madison Square Garden, and people just openly comparing the two. I'm talking about MSNBC interspersing footage of the two events as if to draw parallels, as well as various kind of write-ups referencing this, talking about the rally itself as a kind of orgy of bigotry, which harks back to the worst points in the 20th century. On the one hand, you think they would just drop this for no other reason than it's gotten very tired at this point, and aside from how wrong-headed and unpleasant it is to try and dilute the unique horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust just to have a bash at a right-wing politician you don't like. All of that aside, it's clearly not working. It's still a very close election. There are still many people who are seemingly moving towards Trump because they're so frustrated with the Democrats. But I think it's really crystallized the fact that this smear, this accusation, has always just been a way of trying to delegitimize one side of the argument, to delegitimize a potential democratic outcome ahead of the game. By definition, almost, if you're voting for a Nazi or a fascist, then it's so beyond the pale that it shouldn't almost be taken seriously. Yeah. So I think we've seen that again, but you do think all of these years later, the fact that those ridiculous comparisons are still being trotted out, not just by people on social media, but by very mainstream outlets, it does boggle the mind to some degree, even though we've got quite used to it, I suppose.
Yeah, and we also had Joe Biden weighed in for one of his few appearances in the campaign. We don't know where they've been hiding him.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
He came out saying in his talking to this Latin American channel that Trump supporters are garbage. Now, he denies that he said this. He said he misspoke or whatever, but we know that's what he thinks, really.
Yeah, so it was interesting to see Biden's team scrabbling around to explain that he meant that the all-important apostrophe between supporter and supporters. So the point was that Tony Hinchcliffe, an American comedian who, by the way, is very, very famous for roasting. So he's famous for telling rude jokes and being really, really offensive. Quite an interesting decision to put him on that show at all. But anyway, I totally expected that sort of thing from Tony Hinchcliffe. But then Joe Biden saying that... Did he say that this is their supporters' garbage views, as in a supporter, Tony Hinchcliffe, giving garbage views, or was it the wider pool of supporters that he was referring to? Now, it doesn't really matter. It was a gaffe, and he probably did misspeak or was confused about what he was saying. Who knows? The point is that Joe Biden has been an obvious drain on the Democratic campaign throughout, and that's obviously why they got rid of him. I do think, though, that we need to make reference to the fact that both sides have made this election seem existential for American democracy, because everything that Tom says is absolutely right. And I'd only add that Kamala Harris has tried to, on the one hand, say that Trump is a Nazi and he's holding fascist rallies, but that also she'll be a president for all Americans. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You either believe the people showing up to support Trump are Nazis or you don't. But obviously Trump has also, in a speech at Mar-a-Lago, already claimed that there is evidence of election interference way in advance of any evidence likely to be there. So he's already sowing the seeds, and he deserves utter contempt for that because and you know, it's also worth mentioning that the rally at Madison Square Gardens was full of Trump supporters saying really appalling things about Democratic team members and the like. So both sides have made this feel as though it's a question of American democracy. And that feels very, very worrying, because no matter what the outcome is, there will still be questions about, can American democracy continue to function? I think that's very worrying.
Yeah, and Musk as well has been making arguments to say that this is the last ever legitimate election. You must vote now before the Democrats get in, before they empower every illegal migrant to vote, and apparently they'll only vote Democratic. So yeah, both sides, neither side believes in democracy. Both sides have given up on losers' consent, seemingly since 2016, if not before.
I think one big difference, though, is the fact that, as we've written a lot about and talked a lot about, there obviously was the election denial of the Trumpists, which continues to this day. They're already kind of trying to get their excuses in early to a certain extent. That was to be expected. There is, of course, what I think we've seen, though, is that, first of all, one big difference between the two sides is on the Democratic side, when they try and delegitimize the other position, or actually, you know, try and go after political opponents using the legal system, as has happened with Trump. Obviously, he was convicted of more than 30 charges in Manhattan itself, where he held this particular rally, these trumped up charges. Whether they're pursuing Trump through the courts, whether they're meddling with big tech to get him to suppress stories, as we saw with the Hunter Biden expose, and the way in which you basically saw the US sort of security state lean on the social media companies to suppress what could be a pretty significant story during an election campaign, really kind of put its thumb on the scale to a certain extent. And also the way in which you've also seen various Democratic figures, not just over recent decades, but particularly over the past few years, really cast doubts on electoral results. By dint of it was Russian misinformation. In other cases, you have, Stacey Abrams, who consistently didn't concede her own failed 2 runs at the governorship in Georgia on the basis that there was something iffy going on, and also maybe black male voters in particular were hoodwinked by misinformation. So there's this kind of, I think that the one place in which there is a bit of a distinction is you have, when a leading Democrat suggests there was something fishy about 2016, that is taken seriously by the mainstream media. That will spark an official investigation, which will last months and months and months and months, and continue to push the perception that there was something wrong with the 2016 result, even if the eventual investigation suggests otherwise. And also, they're better at, when it comes to kind of trying to deny elections, they're better at it because they're a bit more subtle.
Yeah.
They don't go around screaming about Venezuelan voting machines that have been rigged to deliver a certain outcome. They cast doubt in a way that kind of passes the sort of Martha's Vineyard dinner table test, and therefore is taken a lot more seriously by people in positions of genuine power. So that's one sort of distinction that I think is quite striking, is that you have got this, as you say, lack of losers' consent that has built up. But what's particularly concerning on the Democratic side is one that's shared across the sort of US establishment, rather than it being the kind of insurgents screaming about stolen elections and not being taken particularly seriously, to be honest.
Yeah. We should talk a bit about where Harris is losing ground. Tom, you've written about this and produced a really good video this week on her sort of failures with ethnic minority voters. Essentially, the Democratic assumption, especially with a black woman leading the campaign, they should be falling into Democratic hands. But actually, a lot of them are going for Trump, which is a bit of a surprising turnout.
So some of the most recent polling from states like Georgia, which about a quarter of Georgian voters are black, Harris is just not as popular among black men as Joe Biden was. And that could obviously make a real difference, because the whole election is going to be decided on a relatively small section of the American voting public. Georgia is one of those key battleground states. I think Tom in his video was right to say that they have been taken for granted. And there's also a really strong sense of denial amongst the Kamala camp. She, if you read pieces in the New York Times and watch CNN, you could believe that there just isn't a problem among black men voting for Kamala Harris. But clearly they thought it was enough of a problem to bring Barack Obama about and sort of try and cajole black men into voting for Kamala Harris. And the really patronizing assumption is that this is rooted in identity politics, that black men just don't feel comfortable voting for a woman or a woman of color. And I don't know where that suggestion comes from. But there's no evidence that is why they're rejecting the politics of the Democratic Party. There's lots of reasons why black men might prefer Trump over Kamala, and they might be rooted in politics. So I think they need to start taking that section of the electorate more seriously. And it could be the decisive factor in an election that's so close.
Yeah. Tom?
Well, I do think it could be a really striking irony that there's so much discussion about Kamala Harris kind of potentially making history as becoming the first woman of colour to become president, the second person of colour to become president, and so on. And yet, looking at the polls as they're currently stood, it would also be historic insofar as it would be the Democrats' potentially lowest share of the African-American vote since the 1960s, which really says something about who this identity politics, which the Democrats are completely marinated in now, actually appeals to. I mean, it has been striking that over the course of the past 10 years in politics, you've basically had the rise of Trump, and in response to that, the wokeification of the Democratic Party. Some of those seeds were sown a long time ago, but it's really come out to the fore. They've really embraced previously quite fringe identitarian ideas. They really started to kind of define themselves in increasingly woke terms against this sort of fever dream of a fascistic MAGA republicanism. And yet during that period, you've seen particularly black and Hispanic voters begin to peel away and migrate over to the alleged white supremacists in the form of Donald Trump. And the party that is claiming to speak much more stridently on behalf of minorities than ever before is repelling precisely those people. So I think it is a reminder that in those very stark terms you see the fact that this elite identity politics, it seems to serve to give kind of upper middle class people, and particularly upper middle class white people, dare I say, a kind of warm feeling. But at the same time, it leaves everyone else cold. And also, it to a certain extent, actually repels the voters, I think, that it claims to speak on behalf of. There might, again, you can't necessarily make all of these conclusions on the basis of what just our polls so far, but the direction of travel over the course of the last two elections has been pretty clear in this direction anyway. So at least you would hope that it would be an opportunity for not just the Democrats, but politics in general to have a reckoning with this sort of identitarian turn and why so many people have embraced it. It may be a reassessment, but I would be very surprised if that reassessment took place. Certainly not before this election, but probably not after it either.
This episode of the Spike podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Now, have you ever had a really good business idea, but then not had the foggiest as to how you're going to go about it? Have you ever thought the world of sales, online marketing, newsletters, all that jazz is just a bit too confusing? Well, if that sounds like you, then have a listen to this. Yes, that's the sound of another sale on Shopify. Shopify is the all-in-one commerce platform you need to start, run, and grow your business. Whether you're selling Oriental rugs or secondhand golf clubs, Shopify takes the hassle out of selling online and in person, so you can focus on growing your business. Shopify can do this all for you, like it has for millions of businesses around the world. You can let Shopify take charge of all of your sales channels, including your vital social media markets like Facebook, Instagram, and TikToks. This means you can keep total control of your business without having to learn any new skills in design or coding or social media. And you never have to feel like upskilling on your own time. Shopify's 24/7 business course library is there to make sure your business goals are never out of reach. And did I mention that you can do this from anywhere in the world? That's right. Shopify's easy-to-use centralized dashboards means that you can manage orders, shipping, and payments wherever you are in the world at whatever time you please. Sign up now for a £1 per month trial at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Let's move on a bit to talk about how identity politics is impacting Britain. I mean, we've just finished the Commonwealth Conference in Samoa, and Keir Starmer came away essentially having to agree that there will be a conversation about reparations for slavery to the former British colonies. Now, obviously, he at first said there's no way this is going to happen. This can't happen. But he seems to not found any argument against it. He seems to the only argument seems to be we don't have the money. Britain's too poor for it.
Well, I looked up the figures, and there was a report authored in 2023 by a judge at the UN that claimed that if Britain were to repay its debts in reparations, it would pay 18 trillion pounds. The gross net asset value of the United Kingdom is about 11 trillion pounds. So we'd have to sell everything we own as a nation in order to meet the bill. It does show you, though, that this is really a performative discussion. And I don't think the Labour Party has any serious intention. I may be proved wrong, but I don't think there is a serious intention to actually pay anything. But it is a performative way of political elites talking about the history of racism and slavery instead of doing things about the structural problems that particular countries face today.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real problem. You know, we're talking about countries that have real economic and political problems. And instead of reckoning with those, we're talking about a completely academic, hypothetical repayment that could never be made and would be completely unjust. Just on the historical point, I mean, it's obviously also worth making the observation that if every country in the world had to repay for their history of slavery, then almost every country in the world would be making huge payments to some portion of either their own population or a foreign one, including many African countries that enslaved Jewish people. And so it's a complete farce, a complete academic game that really equivocates from the real issues that certain countries face.
Tom?
No, absolutely. And I think what's also quite dispiriting about this whole discussion is the way in which it fixes these other Commonwealth countries as kind of forever the supplicant as well. So forever kind of in need of this sort of reparations, in need of this kind of reset purely because of the fact that they almost like can't make it on their own. And that I think is an unpleasant kind of dynamic to this in particular. I think Luke's exactly right about, you know, how far in history do you want to go back? you know, and also when you think about the modern diverse nation that Britain is, if we were in a situation where, say, British taxpayers had to fund some sort of reparations fund for various different Commonwealth countries, you would have a situation in which various people who are themselves the descendants of slaves having to pay reparations to nations where their own parents and grandparents might have actually migrated from. So it's this very bizarre, it doesn't really make sense. There's not a direct line you can draw between these two things. And also, I think relies upon a slightly strange idea of how particular nations have developed as well. The idea that the only reason that the UK is still just about a first world country is because of slavery and colonialism, as if the Industrial Revolution meant nothing, as if the fortunes of a nation can't take different turns is absurd. In the same way as if the only reason that certain nations haven't developed as quickly as others is purely down to whether or not they were colonized or not. There are plenty of examples, if you look around the world, of former colonies that have done pretty well and former colonies which continue to not have been able to develop in the same way. And that's not purely down to those nations or the people within them, natural resources, all kinds of different things play into that. But it's this really simplistic kind of binary that is set up. And I think it's because of the fact that it's not really about any real, let's properly make account for past wrongs and try to make up for it. It's just about feeding a narrative which has become increasingly popular within sort of Western intelligentsia themselves, which is that we are born in sin and we should try to make amends for it in some way, shape or form. And then you just see various leaders who quite understandably are thinking, even if we won't get the 18 trillion out of them, we might get a few 100 million. You can understand why they feel empowered to give it a try at this point in time.
Well, exactly. It's never really spelled out. I mean, obviously, 18 trillion isn't going to happen, but often it's not spelled out what people mean, and people seem to mean different things all the time when they ask for reparations. So I remember there was I think it was the University of Glasgow paid reparations for its links to the slave trade. I mean, it ended up just funding some educational programs in the Caribbean. Sometimes it just means it funds some sinecure for, you know, some sort of woke activity somewhere in a developing country. Sometimes it might mean paying people directly, but you never really get to the rub of it. You always suspect that it's just to fund some naff NGO or whatever, rather than actually helping people on the ground. Yeah,
I mean, you'd hope that the help that these institutions can give to projects or funds overseas could be done on their own terms, rather than saying that this is because you were historically a victim of slavery. I'm sure that kind of funding goes on all the time.
One thing that's interesting, though, that came out of the conference was you had Keir Starmer try to bat away the whole discussion by saying we should look to the future, we should partner on projects around climate change and so on. And then the sort of 1-2 punch was then, well, we also want reparations about climate change because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the fact that developed nations spew so much more carbon than these little island states who are, suffering the consequences of it and so on. So it's quite clear that you can't win on this particular subject. And actually, talking about what form reparations could take, if it did get to that, you would worry that it would be we're going to build you some very unreliable renewable energy rather than actually help you properly develop, which could well be the way this thing goes if these two discussions get fused, as they seem to maybe be.
Yeah, I mean, and the climate thing is fascinating. I mean, we are playing a role as a global power in hindering the development of these countries precisely through climate change. We tell them that they can't, lots of countries in Africa are abundant in oil and gas, for instance, and we're among the powerful countries telling them, no, don't go there because of climate change. So, there is a way to resolve that issue, to industrialize much of Africa, much of the Caribbean, things like that. But we don't seem to want to go there. It's not very fashionable. It's much more fashionable, seemingly, to just pay out from the British taxpayer than actually develop these countries, to actually create wealth that might actually take people somewhere to a better future. This episode of the Spike Podcast is also sponsored by AG1. Now, winter is on its way. It's a time of year where we really need to take care of ourselves. But if you're anything like me, you often feel like you want to slack a bit. There's no pressure to get that beach body ready, for instance. But there's a way to take care of yourself without it feeling like a chore. The way I do it is with AG1. Personally, I take AG1 every morning. AG1 is a comprehensive and convenient blend of 70 high-quality ingredients. One nutritious scoop is easily mixed in with a glass of water before breakfast. It's become one of my most important daily rituals, and it really does make a difference. AG1 is packed with gut-friendly bacteria, antioxidants, high-quality mushrooms, and more. Its dose of vitamin C and zinc helps keep my immune system strong, while other minerals like copper, chromium, and phosphorus help maintain my energy levels throughout the day. It's also great for heart health, thanks to its high levels of thiamine and B vitamins. All of this has been created by a world-class team of scientists with more than 100 years of combined experience. That means that what you drink in AG1 every morning has been developed by leading experts in the fields of regenerative and preventative medicine, genetics, biochemistry, and longevity. You really will be hard-pressed to find a more trustworthy brand. Want to give it a shot? If you want to support your health now and in the long run, start with AG1. Subscribe now and get a free pack of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked to find out more. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. Okay, so let's talk about the Southport attacks. We've gleaned some new information this week. We know that the suspect has been charged with possessing a terror manual and having this poisonous powder called ricin. Luke, obviously there's legal difficulties in speaking around this case because it's an active court case, but it also feels like there's perhaps a reticence to revisit what's been going on here.
Yeah, so it's important to say that there are active criminal proceedings. We can't say anything which even risks prejudicing the outcome of those. The defendant has a right to a fair trial. I'd also say that police investigations are always long. They always take a very long time. Digital material, which is the subject of these new charges, at least in part, takes a long time to, for example, obtain from a device. So there is a clear explanation possibly as to why it took a long time for this evidence to come to light. Similarly, they would have had to have, it's alleged in court that he was in possession of ricin. That's a detail that has been reported, and that would have required testing by the police. And there are all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't immediately go public with this information. I think that it, at the moment, is very, very unclear as to exactly who knew what when. Mm-hmm. The Labour government have come out and said that they only found out about the possibility of new charges 3 weeks ago. In my view, that's totally acceptable and reasonable. Why would the government be kept up to date with necessarily every detail of an ongoing criminal investigation? That could in itself create real political difficulties, and you would want to create a kind of cordon sanitaire between the two. But I do think, having said all of that, we are at some point when this process has concluded, do need to have a reckoning with precisely how the British state responded to the summer riots. Because on the one hand, there was obviously a real urgent need to have a policing response to the riots themselves. They were awful, appalling, violent incidents, which involved in some cases attempts attempted murder of large groups of people. So that demanded a significant police response. There is also another response which is still ongoing, which was effectively the policing the expression of particular opinions around the riots and on particularly online. And I've been working with people who are accused of those offences, and I can say that there are some borderline cases. I think I can say that. So all of this will have to be worked out. I do think, though, that the conspiratorial side of the discussion is actually worrying, because I certainly don't think this was a purposeful cover-up by anyone, either in the government or within the police. And I do think we need to be very careful about calling for more information about criminal proceedings. There is one argument to say that there perhaps is space to allow the public to know a little bit more, a little bit sooner. But I'm not clear that in this particular case, there was any significant delay that wasn't actually justified.
Yeah, even at the beginning, when we didn't know the suspect's name, that was clearly explicable to the fact that he was a minor. Although, having said that, it probably would have been better to have known the truth earlier, not least because that information vacuum seemed to be filled with outright mis and disinformation.
No, absolutely. And the fact that when the essentially the restriction on releasing his name was waived, because he hadn't actually turned 18 when they released his name, they did it a bit ahead of time because they felt like we've got to fill this vacuum, I think shows that there is a discussion to be had about more transparency, about being as upfront as is humanly possible. You don't have to necessarily take as read or just assume that there was some sort of cover up here to suggest that around any kind of case like this, there's always that kind of clearly a kind of tentativeness on the part of people in authority, the part of the police and so on, in terms of what actual information to release, often bred, I think, of a kind of prejudice that you can't talk about these things openly, otherwise you might create some kind of response. And arguably we saw the complete inverse of that. We did have an information vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by conspiracy merchants and hard right agitators pushing fake names around, which certainly egged on, if nothing else, the violence and the racist violence and the targeting of mosques and so on that we saw in the wake of the Southport killing. So I think there does need to be a reappraisal of that. And also the way in which in the current moment, these new charges, the ricin charges, as well as the alleged possession of the terror manual and so on, when you've got MPs trying to just ask the simple questions that need to be asked, who knew what, when was the Prime Minister notified of these new charges and so on and so forth, even that request being cast as conspiratorial and dangerous, and you shouldn't be talking about it, you should just leave it to the authorities.
And Lindsay Hoyle saying you shouldn't raise these things in Parliament.
At all,
where they're exempt from these charges of contempt of court.
And there is a danger that I think Starmer starts to hide behind this all-purposes excuse of this is an ongoing investigation, this is an ongoing trial, we don't want to prejudice it, and therefore shut up, because there is obviously questions to answer, as Luke raised at the beginning, about how the state responded to the crime rather than the alleged crime itself. So it's all of that is kind of being thrown together. But I do also agree that there's also a way in which, you know, if there was an element of caginess on the part of the authorities in terms of when they release this information, again, it's just been used by all of the bad actors to justify some of the misjudged to outright dodgy stuff people were saying in the immediate aftermath of the Southport killing, pushing fake names, for instance. Yeah. So there's, in that vacuum, you not only get the kind of the conspiratorial things being filled, you also have a lot of room for people to basically just so much distrust that they can kind of give themselves cover for some of the things that they did and said in the wake of those awful killings.
Yeah. And Luke, I mean, just returning to the sort of summer riots and some of the arrests for free speech, I mean, are any of those convictions unsafe now, would you say? Or is that jumping the gun?
It's jumping the gun.
Because that seems to be the suggestion on Twitter, so I thought I'd better ask.
Yeah, no, sometimes Twitter lawyers are right. Most of the time they're wrong. But no, that doesn't mean that. I mean, I think that some of the convictions will be built on sound evidence. And the reality is that we have very, very broad speech laws in this country, meaning that it's very, very easy to commit an offence. Yeah. And so if the cases do go up to the Court of Appeal, which is where they would have to go in order to be quashed, there may, the court would take a view on each individual case and the evidence in each individual case and ask whether they weren't, in fact, stirring up racial hatred in what they said. It's actually quite difficult to see from a legal standpoint how this new development would have any impact on any criminal conviction. Because you do, at least, although the laws are very broad, you have to have evidence that there was an intention behind what you said to stir up hatred.
Yeah.
And although in a lot of the cases going through at the moment, that is a borderline issue for some of these people, there are some that are more clear cut. And, the fact of these new developments will not necessarily mean that the evidence that was used to convict them at the time was wrong or inaccurate. So we'll wait and see. There could be some cases, but at the moment, I'm struggling to see how it would happen.
Yeah.
I think it's just a reminder of all this, isn't it? That however we get to the bottom of all of this, this particular case, the implications that it may or may not have, the questions that might want to be asked of government and so on. It's just so important that we have a free and open discussion and that people feel that it is a free and open discussion. I think one of the big impacts of that kind of post-riots period in which you had the state not simply going after the people who were engaging in and directly inciting violence, but going after people who had posted racist memes, going after people who had said outrageous inflammatory things, but to an audience of a few dozen on their social media feeds. With a level of vigor, shall we say, that we haven't seen them pursue even, violent criminals in the past. It created this impression, and I think also was intended to create the impression that you had to really watch what you say.
Yeah.
Not what you do, but what you say. The fact that we had, various government Twitter accounts foghorning the words "think before you post." The Director of Public Prosecution saying even retweeting some of this material could land you in prison. That has had a clear impact on people's just felt ability to even discuss these issues, full stop. And I think the surge in membership that the Free Speech Union are reporting is evidence of that. And it's really not good, just because we shouldn't want to chill free discussion and so on. But also when you do have these instances of censorship and potentially even elements of the state being cagey about letting certain bits of information out at certain points in time, it's only going to breed more distrust, and it's going to create a more fertile sort of seedbed for those people who do want to occupy that information vacuum with bigotry and lies and things to just stir up trouble. So it is a reminder that, like, aside from anything else, we need to have a really clear-eyed, free and open debate about this as possible, and we need to really get to grips with the ways in which the response to the Southport riots and the riots that gripped the country obviously went beyond tackling the violent racial hatred that we saw on our streets and that needed to be clamped down hard upon, and became a general kind of chilling of discussion. And that we've got to be able to separate out those parts, otherwise, we're really going to be in trouble, I think.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.